Today, I wanted to go into a presentation of years of research that I've had in curiosity about the important subject of state antifragility and its implications for international relations. So antifragility is vitally important because surprising and disorienting and potentially dangerous events show no sign of ceasing as we navigate this wonderful 21st century. So to introduce you to this counterintuitive topic, you're looking at an agenda in front of you, which will first dive into the puzzle, problem formulation of how I came to this research question, some key concepts and definitions. I won't dwell too much on it, but for those of you who are interested in where the conceptual home of this research lies in my field, as well as some of the key works of literature that inspired me in researching this topic, I want to spend some time speaking about that, as well as looking at the three original contributions to this dissertation, or this presentation rather, research, is the propensity variables. I won't spend a lot of time on justification of why agent-based modeling was used, wrong crowd, but I will discuss how it was executed in this research. We will briefly cover some verification and validation. We'll talk about how I ran some experiments using this model, look at those results as they provide us some key intuitions regarding antifragility. And then really what I want to talk about is diving into these two case studies that I had personal experience with in both senses, to examine how the principles of antifragility emerged during these two scenarios. And then finally look at some abstractions and some limitations of the research and understand where you all have ideas and where there could be some changes to improve and expand upon this research. So as I said, the 21st century is really characterized by an international community, in this case, that's hyper-globalized. And what I mean by that is everyone is connected to everything else. And when we see effects in one area of the world, they're often felt in other areas of the world, whereas before we had this disconnection. And it's also punctuated by these periods of defining characteristics, such as the rise of violent extremism that we've seen, organizations, or VEOs as I call them, that function like nation states if we look at groups like ISIS, escalation of the effects of climate change, global finance collapses, and a global pandemic as we see currently. So in this world, though, some states are dealing with stressors better than others, and in some instances, they're even benefiting from these global stressors. So I argue in my research that these states are bound by a set of commonalities that under certain conditions may give rise to new state characteristic worthy of future explanation. So that is to say three things. First, that states are better able to sense and respond in these cases. These states possess some level of resources that, coupled with the right strategy, achieve some desired end state. And third, and most importantly, these states are learning better than other states from their experiences. And so it's from these observations, coupled with the notions that our theories that we have in international relations have kind of failed in some instances to anticipate and explain certain key events over the previous century, that really resulted in my curiosity to explain this observation by searching across disciplines for a new concept to provide increased explanatory power of these critical events. So at the heart of this puzzle, what I'm referring to is fragile states. So what does fragility mean? It means that fragility is manifesting itself in various ways within a nation state. That is to say, a state that is fragile is one that is characterized by a certain set of attributes, which include things like the erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, or the inability to provide reasonable public services. So with this in mind, it became evident that understanding key theoretical concepts that lead a state to become fragile or something more is important. So in this case, and the purpose of this research, fragile is defined as an entity that deteriorates upon experiencing some stress. And after that period of stress, it recovers it fails to recover, pardon me, to a state prior to experience the stress or stressor. So you can see here that after some recovery period, it does not achieve the same state as it previously experienced. Beyond fragility, though, lies this term resilience, and what we might commonly understand through Darwin's phrase is only the fittest survive, right? That is, an entity that is resilient is one that deteriorates upon experiencing some stress or stressor, but after some period of recovery, recovers to the same period or same value that it had prior to experience the stress. So that is, it does no better and it does no worse. But finally, to really scratch this curiosity and this itch that I had, I came across a term in my professional capacity, first coined by Nicholas Nassim Taleb in his book, Antifragile: Things That Gain from Disorder. And so Taleb describes this term antifragility as a counterintuitive one that has profound implications for the way in which we review the world. And so for him, he defines antifragility as an entity or thing that deteriorates upon experiencing some stress or stressor, but after that recovery period has actually benefited or gained from having experienced that stress or stressor. So given these three categories, I like to liken them to a spectrum, and that is to say that fragile states exist on one end, the left-hand side, if you will, and anti-fragile states exist on the right-hand side, with resilient states somewhere in the middle. And it's a fluid process whereby states can navigate and move through these three different categories over time. So this leads me to the heart of this puzzle. And that is, what makes some states more anti-fragile than others? And why does this really matter? Why should we care about this in international relations in our everyday life? And so when doing so, I had to identify this theoretical home, right? What am I talking about? Where am I placing this literature into the broad swath of international relations literature? And for those of you who are really interested in this, at the end of the day, this topic really belongs in the theoretical home of realism, because we are talking about things like tempering anarchy in the international system. We're talking about power. We're talking about concepts of survival. This particular dissertation or research that I have focuses on extending the billiard ball model that we're all familiar with. And so all that is to say, it resides in this theoretical home of realism as opposed to others that may exist. Personally, I don't consider myself a realist. I would consider myself a social constructivist, which I'm happy to talk about later if you're interested. But for the purpose of this research, this is where we're focusing our efforts. So I mentioned that spectrum, right? And talking about looking at where that gap in the literature might exist. And so for me, this led me really to two prominent indices to really understand how fragility or fragile states were quantified in my field of study. And so it led me to two prominent ones, and that is the Fragile States Index, formerly called the Failed States Index, if you're familiar, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Index. And they're comprised of variables and criteria by which each of these organizations evaluate states and publish their results, on an annual basis. But they stop short of explaining how states move beyond resilience to benefit from stress. And so that is to say, they don't take into account this idea of anti-fragility as a third potential outcome of state behavior. So what this research tries to do is address that missing piece of the puzzle, that is how states become anti-fragile in the international environment. And so, for those of you who are interested in the literature, I've kind of parsed out here on this slide different areas at the top in bold that help me organize the literature that I went through in order to understand both fragile states and anti-fragility. And so as any good scientist knows, in order to get to where we want to go, we have to know where we've been in the past. And so this is meant to be an interdisciplinary examination of the literature on fragility, resilience, and anti-fragility, with a special emphasis on the literature on modeling and simulation as it pertains to anti-fragility. So what you see here is a sampling of that literature partitioned into 4 organizational groupings. And that is the key influencers on anti-fragility, characteristics of state fragility, the literature that contributed to the development of these 3 propensity variables that I'll talk about, and important observations. So that is the outcome of fragility, resilience, and anti-fragility are the result of these entity's composition and how it interacts with the environment. So that was one key observation that really stood out in this literature before, is that it sort of seemed to me that anti-fragility was considered this inherent characteristic that entities or people or things or organizations were endowed with. However, it's really this result of an interaction between that entity and its environment. And you'll see that play out in the model. I'll also talk a little bit about, at the end of the presentation, other directions that I had originally intended for this research to go in, and may still explore in the future, as they place a little bit more emphasis on the role of the environment in producing anti-fragility. But for this purpose of this slide, I really want to focus on 2 key works of literature. And so I want to focus your attention to Taleb and Treverton 2015, who were really the first to identify the characteristics of state anti-fragility. So Taleb is responsible for sort of this broad umbrella concept of anti-fragility. And it wasn't until 2015 when Nassim Taleb and Gregory Treverton co-authored a piece originally for RAND, for the CIA, on anti-fragility, and then subsequently spun off that research into a foreign affairs article that you can access today. But in that foreign affairs article, they describe these 5 characteristics of state anti-fragility. And so those are concentrated decision-making, history of surviving past shocks, debt to leverage ratio, economic diversity, and political variability. And so if we look at those variables, we can see again that we have this spectrum that Taleb and Treverton have come up with. So they would say here that an increase in political variability, will lead to higher anti-fragility, whereas a decreased political variability leads to decreased anti-fragility, or fragility in this case. An increase in economic diversity is a good thing for anti-fragility, whereas a decrease in economic diversity is a bad thing. Same thing for concentrated decision-making, where we're looking at governance types, regime types. Those that are less concentrated are better serve the purposes of anti-fragility, whereas those that are more tightly coupled and more concentrated are not good for anti-fragile outcomes. And most shockingly, to some, or counterintuitive to most, especially in my field, is this idea of a history of surviving past shocks. So that is, when we think of chaos and turbulence and anarchy in the international system, we tend to think of it as a bad thing. It's a negative thing. But Taleb and Treverton say, hold the phone. This is actually a good thing, because through that history of surviving past shocks, if you're able to do that, regardless of the outcome, over a period of time, you can become anti-fragile. And so what I do in this research is actually look at what sort of goes into that history of surviving past shocks. And you'll see that play out in this variable of learning that I've come up with. But all of this is to say that these folks really laid the foundational work for anti-fragility as it pertains to nation states in international relations. So the second piece that I want to segue into is this research by John Johnson and Adrian Gheorghi, who I'm proud to say is also a faculty member at Old Dominion University. And so what their paper does is provide us with an important system dynamics model that provides readers with this system of system approach to understanding the emergence of anti-fragility. And so in that, they give us the the big picture, right? The general system structure of what it takes to become anti-fragile. But what they lack is this inner workings of what happens within an organization or entity to produce that anti-fragile outcome. So what you see here are two complementary pieces of work from Taleb and Treverton, which provide us with the internal workings of the system, or the characteristics of the entity within the system, to produce anti-fragile outcomes. And then from Johnson and Georgi, we actually have that broader system, and the two fit very nicely inside of one another to influence the work that you'll see here regarding this agent-based model. So with that, after all of the literature review and examining both literature from biology and international studies and sociology and ecology on fragility, resilience, and anti-fragility, as well as that on modeling and simulation, which is very nascent, by the way, I've come up with this idea of 3 propensity variables. That is to say, I've taken Taleb and Treverton's 5 variables and created these 3 propensity variables because of the fact that there was really no explanation within Taleb and Treverton's work of the 5 characteristics of state fragility. That is, he never tells us how they work together to produce these outcomes. They only identify these variables. So additionally, I also observed that the authors provided no indication of under what conditions the variables produce fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile outcomes. So if you recall, one of the key observations from my literature is that the entity must interact with its environment to produce some outcome, whether that be fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile. And so as we know, environmental conditions in the international environment especially are diverse and complex. And so when we talk about, when we're in academia and we're talking about research, we're always talking about under what conditions does this emerge? Under what conditions can we observe these observations? And so I decided to evolve Taleb and Treverton's characteristics of state anti-fragility into these 3 propensity variables, with the understanding here that the propensity variables, or the word propensity, means that there is an indication for these variables to produce fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile outcomes, but there's no guarantee, right? That is solely dependent on what happens in that interaction with the environment. So all of this is to say that these 3 variables of agility, power conversion, and learning may give rise under certain conditions to these 3 possible outcomes. And so if I go through these variables real quick, with agility, we're talking about the ability of a state, the speed and magnitude, with which a state can sense, respond, adjust, and adapt their strategies as a function of these changing circumstances. So we're really focusing on a state's ability to sense something in the international environment and then respond to it with speed and the appropriate magnitude. Power conversion is something that comes directly from Joseph Nye when he talks about power being used to get resources to behavioral outcomes, desired behavioral outcomes that a state wants from another. So in this case, he defines power conversion as resources plus an appropriate strategy. You have to have both in concert with one another. You cannot just be well endowed with resources and squander them through a lack of strategy or an ill-fitted strategy for those resources. And conversely, you cannot have a wonderful strategy with no resources to execute those. So this will come into play, particularly later as we're talking about case studies for Iraq and China in the Indo-Pacific later. And then most importantly, the 3rd variable is this of learning. So how states learn from this history of experiencing previous shocks is critical in this model. I cannot underscore enough how there needs to be more research on learning, in particular of states in international relations. So if that's one thing that emerged from this research, it is the need for more research on this topic of learning and how states learn. But this is just, exercising your judgment based on some experience and input that leads actors to a different view set, or to understand how thinking or patterns of behavior change or evolve based on some experience. So I won't go into this slide, right? This is the wrong crowd, but to justify why using modeling and simulation, going over the advantages of it, the disadvantages of it, why I chose agent-based modeling in this case. For me, it was always a desire to utilize this methodology because it was extensible, because I knew I was not the authority on this subject, but rather starting the research and laying that foundation for future iterations and extensions of a model. That was my hope. To me, agent-based modeling fit the bill for that and allowed for this desire to hopefully come to fruition if you all find this interesting enough. So let's look at the model. I want to give you an idea of an understanding of the players involved in the simulation, and particularly as it pertains to the environment and the agent. So here on your screen in the upper right-hand corner, you're seeing a screenshot from my agent-based model executed in NetLogo. The state, as you see, is a primary agent. I went with a single state because I was interested in understanding the behavior of a single state, knowing that this model could be expanded to subsequent iterations and having future more than one state in the model as well. So in this case, the state's endowed with a certain characteristics, right, that make for more or less fragility, anti-fragility, or resiliency. It's indicated by the shape of a circle, and it has different colors depending on what category of fragility it falls into. So red indicates a fragile state, yellow indicates a resilient state, green indicates an anti-fragile state. And so that agent moves about the world randomly and interacts with red patches on the board. And that means that those patches are representative of stress in the international environment. So those are indicated by a red square. They have an intensity value that they are endowed with based on a gamma distribution, and particularly looking at the mean and variance, which I played with a little bit in some of the experimentation you see. And depending on how chaotic the environment is, we can change the number of stressors in the environment to just a few or many, as you can see on the board here. It's a very chaotic environment. So that's the broad picture. Looking at the model variables, I want to walk you through how I endowed the state with the characteristics that they have in the final model. So on the very left-hand side, you're seeing straight from the literature the 5 variables of Taleb and Treverton that come in the form of concentrated decision-making, political variability, economic diversity, debt to leverage ratio, and this history of surviving past shocks. In the previous slides, I talked a little bit about the 3 propensity variables that I came up with. So you can see how Taleb and Treverton's characteristics merged to create these 3 propensity variables. Concentrated decision-making and political variability, I determined impacted a state's ability to be agile in the international environment. Whether or not you have the correct economic diversity and debt to leverage ratio impacts your resources and how you're best able to leverage those. And then this history of surviving past shocks really influences and impacts this idea of learning. But in the final model and iteration, I underwent a 3rd evolution of these variables into what you're seeing here on the screen. So all of that is to say, though agility is not explicitly modeled in the final code of this model, you are seeing agility play out in the final variables of the model here, particularly as we're talking to recovery time here, as well as recovery magnitude. We are looking at power conversion when we talk about a state's performance and capacity, and we're talking about learning and seeing that manifest when we talk about learning and forgetfulness in the model. So looking at these final variables here, we can see that recovery time of an agent is defined as the amount of time it takes for a state to recover from a shock. How long does that take? The magnitude is defined as the extent to which the state recovers. Does it recover very well? Does it recover a small amount? What does that variable look like? Learning is defined as the ability of a state to learn from its previous experiences. Forgetfulness is defined as the forgetfulness of the state from its previous experiences. But I really want to hone in on these two variables of performance and capacity, because performance here is defined as the ability of the state to absorb stress without dying. And capacity here is defined as the characteristic of the state's type. So whether it's fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile. So how well a state performs impacts its future capacity to perform in the future, if you will. I'll get into that a little bit later. But essentially capacity is that color code that you see or saw in the previous slide. So that is to say, if it's fragile, the capacity is at a certain value and the agent is red, or if it's at a certain another value, it's resilient and it's considered, it's a yellow color. But there's this interplay between performance and capacity that you'll see play out here in the model. Oops. Oops. No. Okay, so when we look at the model process and we want to dive into the mechanics of this, there's really three phases of this. So in this first phase here, you're seeing what's going on with the state prior to hitting a shock and when it's not actively recovering. So in this case, the state is maintaining some performance at some value S, right? It's just got this performance value. And depending on the magnitude of the forgetting parameter, the state anti-fragility capacity increases and the state may transition from anti-fragile to resilient to fragile. And then, as indicated by the second picture here, the state hits a shock that has some magnitude. Immediately when the state hits the shock, its performance is reduced by whatever the shock magnitude is. And that's regardless of the type of state, because we know that regardless of whether you're fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile, you are going to deteriorate upon hitting or experiencing some shock. And it's in that recovery period that matters. So after the state hits the shock, the recovery magnitude is set based on the type, right? Whether you are fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile, and the number of recovery periods we've had. So in some cases, we can play with the recovery period in the model to say, give us a really long recovery period or give us a shorter recovery period. And so then, depending on the magnitude of the learning parameter and state anti-fragility capacity will either increase so that the state can move up from a state of fragile to resilient or resilient to anti-fragile. And then if performance hits zero, the state can no longer function, it dies and the simulation terminates. But after that period, right, so after the state has experienced that stress or shocker, it goes into this recovery period and it recovers to this new performance value that you see here. So in this case, we had an anti-fragile agent hit a shock with some magnitude, it deteriorated and became a resilient state. For model verification and validation, it was a very informal process for the purpose of this research. I do want to highlight down here one of the key areas of verification and validation, particularly validation, came through the use of case studies, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But to give you an intuition about how the model runs, to make sure that this is acting in accordance with how we would anticipate fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile agents to behave, we can see here that yes, we've coded the thing correctly. We have a red dot. It's hit a shock. Its performance is deteriorating over time, and it has spent the majority of its time being a fragile agent. And so just to give you a few intuitions about that, again, we have performance here. We can see that it's recovered to the same value, but it hit a shock with enough magnitude and intensity behind it that it was enough to terminate the simulation, and that the agent did, in fact, spend the majority of its time being a resilient agent. And then finally, with fragility, or anti-fragility, pardon me, we can see here again the same thing. We have a green agent the performance increases with each subsequent interaction with a shock, and the majority of its time is spent being an antifragile agent. So these are just some screenshots to give you sort of the individual agent behavior of each of the three state types. So what's really interesting now is not that, but the experimental structure and how we can answer different questions based on the characteristics of state antifragility, how the model was set up. So what did I do? Well, I created two different worlds. In world A, I wanted to really focus on why antifragility is important for state survival. Tell me why this characteristic is important for states as they navigate the international environment and experience stress and stressors. So in this case, I went with a factorial design. The state type in this case is fixed. That is the state type that begins at the start of the simulation is what the end of the simulation will render. So if it starts fragile, it will end fragile. If it starts resilient, it will end resilient. There's no change in the state type over the course of the simulation. And I also held the percent learn and percent forget variables constant. So in that world, again, understanding why antifragility is important for state survival. In world B, I wanted to play around with the learning and forgetfulness variables. So I wanted to answer a completely different question, but one that is related to the overall research question, in that I wanted to examine what kind of world, right, under what conditions, again, is best for maintaining antifragility. So in order to do that, I had to examine and play around with the percent learn and percent forget variables. In this world, I want to emphasize that the state type is not fixed. That is, they can undergo this evolution and transformation throughout the course of the simulation. So if a state starts out fragile, it may end up antifragile by the end of the simulation, or any number of combinations. And again, going with another factorial design here. So overall, this slide is to say that the experimental structure led to two distinct questions, two distinct designs in which the percent learn and percent forget variables were held constant in one, but varied in the other, in order to address two questions. Number one, why is antifragility important for state survival? Right? Why should we care about this? Why should states want to know more about this? And then what world should states seek or fashion to maintain that antifragility? And so again, this is just a summary. If you're really interested in understanding how to set up the model, sort of what are those factors that went into designing each of those worlds. So the results. So in this case, I'm only focusing on a specific subset of the results that came from the broader paper. So specifically wanted to examine the idea of life length here. I could examine and did examine in the paper a number of other variables, such as initial performance, final performance, etc. But for the purpose of these slides, I wanted to focus on life length, because when we're talking about state survival, how long you live matters, right? That's everything in terms of state survival. So that's why this variable is here before you. So just to decode this slide, if you're looking at the left-hand side, we're looking at world A, understanding why antifragility is important for state survival. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at world B, which is understanding what world is best for maintaining antifragility. So here we're looking at the impacts of antifragility, resilience, and fragility on life length with respect to the number of initial performance. So how well that state starts out at the beginning of the simulation with its initial performance value. And as you can see in world A, the life length is relatively short for all states with that low initial performance value. But the anti-fragile states really start to benefit from that increase in initial performance around the 5 value, I'll say. And then in world B, you can see with an increase in initial performance, there's an increase in life length across all state types. Here, I wanted to examine recovery time as one of the variables here. So in world A, examining an increase in recovering time or an observation of an increase in recovery time has led to the decrease of life length for each state. So that is to say, the longer it takes a state to recover from a shock, the less time it will be spent alive, right? Because it's continuously experiencing other shocks during that recovery period, and it can't fully catch up and recover. So in world B, when we do have learning and forgetfulness at play, we can see an increase in recovery time, with an increase in recovery time, life length decreases with the exception of the anti-fragile state, who actually benefit from a longer recovery time during this interim period between the 5 and 11 value mark. And so now what happens when we make the world more or less chaotic and vary the number of shocks in the environment? So in world A, where there's no learning and there's no forgetfulness, with an increase in the number of shocks, right, an increase in the amount of chaos in the international environment, the life length of each state type will decrease, period. In world B, however, we see an increase in the number of shocks. The life length for the fragile and resilient state type decrease, right, which we would expect. But the anti-fragile, this is where this gain from having a history of surviving past shock or experiencing stressor really comes into play, and they're able to handle more chaos and actually benefit from it, as you're seeing here. So in this one, I did want to point out a particularly interesting case in world B. And that is what happens when we look at an increase in learning and forgetfulness. So, right, recall that world B is that world where we played around with these variables. In world B, when we have an increase in forgetfulness, we see a decrease in life length. But when we increase our learning and our ability to learn as a state, we see an increase in life length for the state. So all of these are sort of validating our intuitions about antifragility and what we know or how they should behave according to, you know, Taleb and Treverton's 5 characteristics, as well as the results of Johnson and Georgi's system dynamics model. So here we wanted to look at the number of shocks and the impact on performance. And this is a really interesting case study or example here, because as we saw in world A, with an increase in the number of shocks, life length decreased for resilient and fragile states, but increased for, or excuse me, this isn't life length, pardon me, this is final performance. So how well a state does at the end of the simulation, or how well it's doing. So what's interesting here, if you juxtapose that with life length, that if you recall in the previous slide, as you increase the number of shocks in world A, life length decreased. But here you're seeing that performance of the antifragile actually increases despite that decrease in life length. And in world B, what you're seeing is a significant increase in the antifragile with regards to average final performance as you increase the number of shocks. So this was a really interesting observation to see that inverse occur, where performance actually increased despite life length decreasing. So now, you know, all of this is great and it's theoretical, but why does it matter and how does this apply to the real world? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do here, is answer questions and explain observations in the real world. So to demonstrate how the case studies show antifragility, you're going to see here a combination of historical analysis and how that relates to the simulation model. So in this case, I was really interested in observing and understanding the Iraq War, the second Iraq War from 2003 to 2011, and the consequences of that war. My husband's an active duty Marine. He served in this war. He served in Fallujah. It has impacted every aspect of our lives since we became adults. And so we wanted to understand sort of what this looks like through the lens of antifragility. And so when you do this, you've got to sort of look at the preceding war. So in the first Gulf War, right, we see observations where the United States really rallied an impressive international coalition to drive Saddam Hussein out of Iraq, or out of his Iraqi forces, pardon me, out of Kuwait. And so this demonstrated a high number of resources as coalitions or force multipliers with a well-defined strategy by the United States to achieve their objectives. So that power conversion, resources plus strategy. And it had honestly been preparing for this conflict with the Soviet Union prior to this. So it had this experience in training and learning for a particular conflict that never came to fruition once the Soviet Union collapsed. So learning was really pertinent to the enemy that was to come, because in the interim period between the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, Al-Qaeda Central was amassing resources while devising a strategy to execute the largest attack on the United States since Pearl Harbor. So they were introducing shocks into the environment through events such as the USS Cole, the previous World Trade Tower bombings, to increase their learning and agility. So if you're looking at what you're seeing on the screen here, the United States is sort of, we haven't really gotten into this yet, right? We're talking about the preceding, but what you're going to see here is by the time the United States hits 9/11, it starts to, pardon me, lose some of its performance capabilities, whereas Al-Qaeda Central is really gaining them. And so we're going to see how that plays out here soon. So by the time that the United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda Central on September 11th, it had really all but forgotten the lessons that it learned from the last entanglement that involved insurgent forces, which was that of Vietnam, that had occurred 30 years ago. So as the U.S. enters Iraq, it achieves its traditional military objectives with relative ease, that is deposing Saddam Hussein from power, but in doing so creates this vacuum whereby a disenfranchised Sunni minority, establishes a franchisee of Al-Qaeda Central, that is Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so the enemy in this case has shifted. It's no longer the Iraqi military or Saddam Hussein, but rather this insurgent group of Iraqi citizens. So learning played a big factor, with the United States, but it was the wrong type of learning, as it was not primed to deal with insurgent forces, because the last experience that it had with insurgent forces was over 30 years ago during the Vietnam War. So demonstrating this lack of learning, the United States loses the war on terror for a certain period of time, until General Petraeus introduces the surge of troops in 2007. So that as he does this strategy course correction and couples the strategy with the correct resources in order to give the United States the advantage and momentum to ultimately defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so over here, what you're seeing in the simulation is that at the start, right, we talked about Al-Qaeda Central, introducing those shocks into the system, gaining a performance, having a history of surviving past shocks because they are learning from these experiences, to the height of their power in 2004, when it is outmaneuvering and outpacing the United States in Iraq, till eventually we see that strategy change by General Petraeus and we see Al-Qaeda in Iraq's performance change. So the takeaways for this is that there were some unintended consequences of the first Gulf War that impacted the second Gulf War, particularly as it pertains to these three propensity variables: learning, power conversion, and agility. Learning matters, right? The right type of learning matters in this case, and the United States did not have that learning or that experience. And most importantly for the United States, resources without strategy matters, right? When you have these resources primed for a particular type of conflict and don't have the appropriate strategy, that can be detrimental to your performance, as we see here. So for this, it's important to point out that violent extremist organizations or organizations like Al-Qaeda in Iraq can actually gain from disorder, benefit. They too can be anti-fragile. And learning matters, right? They spent this interim war period introducing shocks into the environment to be able to learn from those, to know what they could get away with or how they could best execute their attack on September 11. And if you don't have shocks, you can create them to learn from them. And so this is a really interesting case study to look at and understand anti-fragility. Most importantly for me, because it is such a counterintuitive one to think that the United States of America, the most powerful military in the world, could at some point in time be outmaneuvered and beaten at certain points in time in military conflict by a non-state actor. Essentially a bunch of ragtag insurgents in Iraq who were able to leverage these three propensity variables for a certain period of time against the United States. So now if we look into a case study near and dear to my heart, as I spent some time at the Indo-Pacific Command talking about the new hotness, which is global power competition in the Indo-Pacific. And so as the United States was really caught up in these entanglements in the Middle East, the result is that it wasn't focused on the behavior of the People's Republic of China in the Indo-Pacific region. And its learning opportunities to understand China and what was going on in this region were not as prevalent as before. So during this conflict, right, it's caught up in the Middle East and it's not preparing again for another global power competition or another potential conflict with a nation state in the Indo-Pacific. And so what you see here is that over the course of its history, China's really undergone this rapid economic ascent in the international political community in a really short period of time. It's joined the WTO at the urging of the United States. It's undergone this rapid military modernization. And it's implementing efforts such as the Belt and Road Initiative throughout Africa. And so we're seeing the signals of China that it's interested also in the Indo-Pacific region. And like that of Al-Qaeda-Centra, it's introducing something a little bit less than shocks in the region to grab the attention of the international community so that the Communist Party can learn from these provocations, building artificial islands, illegal unregulated fishing, sailing too close to other vessels, things like that that we're seeing in the region to provoke responses so that they too can learn from them. But meanwhile, the focus of the United States, again, is not on China, it's on the Middle East. And so it's not on the US's radar until about 2017 when we start to see changes in things like our combatant command names where Indo-Pacific Command now becomes Indo-Pacific Command as we're pivoting and paying attention to these things. So all of this is to say is that we're seeing China winning this influence operation in the Indo-Pacific region with allies and partners. And we can see that they are perceived to be anti-fragile vis-a-vis the United States through this great global power competition. Because the United States, again, as you see here, is caught up in other entanglements. It's not learning relative or vis-a-vis China and what's going on in the Indo-Pacific. So it's going to lose its power and capacity to address that particular threat. China, on the other hand, is perceived to be anti-fragile here, but it's got some things working against it that we should really focus on, I think, if we're going to address China. And that is, it appears to be anti-fragile, but the problematic issues are, A, this history of surviving past shocks. China has not been involved in a conflict in a long time. It especially has not been involved in a direct conflict with the United States in a long time. And instead, it is learning from the lessons of other states' conflict. So I talked a little bit about the rapid rise of China's modern militarization efforts. That was influenced by the first Gulf War, and seeing that the United States was able to take the fight afar and win overwhelmingly and successfully in Iraq the first go around really spurred China's interest in modernizing their military. So it's learning at a distance, but not through direct learning. So it's indirect learning. That's really interesting. But also this idea of concentrated decision making. So we've seen some internal rumblings within China with regard to Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, other human rights violations that may prove more salient in the future to the international community and cause potentially a rumbling or the start of a crack within. Won't go over the model abstracts and limitations. I'm happy to provide those to you if you're interested in them. Looking at the future work, really interested in developing the propensity variables further and examining those on a deeper level. For the agent and expansion of the model, really interested in understanding state-on-state interactions, not just state environment interactions. Also understanding the roles of allies and partners, because as we know in international studies, we can always call on our friends for help. And this idea of international organization membership and treaties and securities, what role do those play? Do those matter? Do those have an impact on whether a state is more or less fragile or anti-fragile? And then again, I mentioned state learning and the need to understand that on a deeper level as it pertains to both direct learning and indirect learning, as we see with the China case study. And so, to sum it up here, really calling and advocating for more studies of anti-fragility, at least using this as a lens with which to view our problem sets across a variety of disciplines, understanding that state learning is critical as it pertains to fragile, resilient, and anti-fragile outcomes, looking at implications for things like deterrence and security and governance structures. Perhaps it is that we can see that there is a right amount of chaos in the world that needs to, that could be maintained. So if there are states out there that benefit from chaos, it is, and they are anti-fragile, it's to their benefit to cause some trouble and to maintain that level of chaos so that they continue to benefit from it. And then finally, looking at transforming challenges into opportunities. So how anti-fragility, right, impacts how states can benefit from disorder and randomness, right? Perhaps it states to embrace, right? Perhaps we should start to embrace some level of randomness and disorder rather than try to suppress that randomness and disorder through things like our governance structures or right, inclusion in things like international organizations, et cetera. I don't know what that looks like. I know that these are some of the questions that came out of my research. So before I take questions, I do want to make one more comment because I talked a little bit about how I might have otherwise conducted this research. And so one of those areas I really want to put forth to this group is this idea of the environment and epigenetics. And so I became really enthralled with this idea of epigenetics through my own personal experiences. I have an autoimmune disorder. And I was quite caught off guard by this autoimmune disorder in my early 20s because all of the indicators and all of the demographics that said I would have this, I certainly did not have. And so for me, it was really understanding that genetics is one way to look at things, but this idea of interaction between the environment and a person can trigger something. So using epigenetics as a metaphor, understanding that we are endowed with certain characteristics, but they are triggered or turned on and off by certain environmental interactions is really interesting to me. And it's one area where I thought I would go with this particular research, didn't, but would like to put that out there for future iterations and exploration. So it's now 5 a.m. I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to, I guess, Dr. Collins.
Hey, hi. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for the presentation. I'll do the clapping for everybody. So we do have a number of questions in the chat. So I was just going to go through them one by one, if that's okay. I'm going to go them in order they're appearing. I think that sort of makes sense. So one question came up was a technical question at the start, which is Jacob asked, which was, why is power conversion equal to resources plus strategy as opposed to resources times strategy?
So this was a direct definition that came from Joseph Nye. If you read his, I can't think of the name of the book right now. I can find the title of it for you later. But essentially, just it was taking something directly from the literature and saying that I was interested in this idea of power. It was his latest iteration of power, which included this idea of strategy, and so that was sort of the impetus for the decision there. I think it would be interesting, certainly, to play it out the other way and see what it means with resources, time strategy. And I'm sort of maybe turning it back to Jacob and ask you, like, what would you think would be different about that outcome rather than having the simple addition?
Yeah, I mean, go for it, Jacob.
So yeah, I was just curious because it seemed to me like if you have zero strategy, then then you would get nothing out of your resources, it seemed to me.
Right. And
So
so that's why you sort of saw that third evolution of the variables. So power conversion again was indirectly modeled through that third variable iteration. I think it was performance and capacity is where you saw those two variables play out. And so looking at that definition of power conversion, you know, for Joseph Nye, it's a literal one. For me, it's sort of a theoretical one that was indirectly explored in the model.
I mean, it was the right thing to do at the time. I think absolutely. Next question for you: what is the difference between antifragility and adaptiveness, or being adaptive?
So I think they're related. The more so I think they're related in the sense that if you are adaptive, you could have an anti-fragile outcome. So for me, fragility, resiliency, and anti-fragility are some end state that occurs, but adaptability is what is occurring inside the system as it is experiencing that stressor or shock. So I think there was also a question I had, and I think I addressed this again in my paper revisions. Can't remember what the term was actually. Anyway, it was really interesting because it dealt more with what was actually happening during the stressor, during that time of period of experiencing stress, vice the outcome of stress. And so for me, anti-fragility is an outcome, whereas adaptability is part of the process and what's happening as it's interacting with that stress.
Thank you. Cool. Yeah, no, I'm still impressed you keep going at 5 a.m. I don't think I could cope with this. So, okay, we've got one more question, then we'll open it up, and then we'll try and wrap up, just conscious of everybody's time. I'll do this question from the thing here, and then ask if anybody's got one more question beyond that. So, for the Iraq War case study, did you calibrate your model using parameters according to some real values, or did you use some parameters captured from some qualitative features? You know, what did you use?
These were wholeheartedly theoretical values, right? I just pulled ranges and values and said, based on my observations, I saw the United States have a value of X with performance at this time. We're going to start out the model with this and see what happens. I would like absolutely to go back and redo this paper and have corresponding real world values to map back to those propensity variables and the variables that you see in the model wholeheartedly. But overall, the whole model is theoretical in nature. And so that's what you're seeing there.
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to open up, just very conscious of time. I hate to do this to you guys, but let's open up for one more question. Has anybody else got a question they'd like to ask Rebecca? Feel free, just jump in, just unmute. Cool. If not, I've got a question for you. So, no, this is an easy one, right? So looking at antifragility, I mean, what do you feel of in the real world right now, the Taliban situation in terms of antifragility, and especially in terms of Afghanistan? I mean, I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. So I think you will see a force multiplier in this case, and you will see China enter that power vacuum, and you will see something happen there, is my indication, whether it is through resource allocation or supplementing resources there. But that is my prediction for what you're going to see happen here, that China will help pick up the pieces of the remnants of the Taliban for that power vacuum. So